Hello, hello. Welcome back to your favorite class reductionist podcast. Joining us today is the fabulous and most baddest bitch, Kayla. And we have Camila, is a reporter. She follows Latin American politics very closely. She is the founder of Kawishu News.
We are going to talk about the political situation in Peru. We're going to talk about the current election that happened there. And we are going to talk about Pedro Catillo, and we're going to learn more about him and the movement that he's starting there, and his plans for Peru, and why U.S. imperialists are freaking out about it. But before we get into that, why don't we talk about there seems to be a historical cycle of movements that have been rising out of the region there. So why don't we start with Kayla? Kayla, why don't you start us off on this?
So when we talk about like Pedro Castillo and where a lot of his base comes from, the majority of his base is definitely more concentrated in like the Andean region, the southern end of Peru, and the La Selva, the jungle area, which is on the, look at the map, the eastern side of Peru. And as the flip side, Keiko Fujimori, where she received a lot of her support, was from the coastal cities, especially like the northern coastal cities, and the foreign vote. So let's talk a little bit about where Pedro Castillo's base is. And Pedro Castillo, he comes from Puno. It's in the, if I'm not mistaken, the Chota district in, I forget the province, but it sits right on Lake Titicaca, which on the other side
Cajamarca.
In Cajamarca, there you go. He's from Cajamarca, and it on the other side is very close to Bolivia. So this is a very countryside, rural side of Peru, which is the majority of where his base is. And it's funny because when you were watching how it's like during the elections, when all the votes were coming in, I would look and, keep up with what Peruvians were saying, on social media. And some of we call them petucos, like these really upper class, elite class people. I don't know, you would call them like kind of frat kind of people, whatever, but in the Peruvian context. And they were just, raging in on how these people from Arequipa, from all those Ayacucho, these places where Sendero Luminoso was very popular before in the 80s and the 90s. And because Pedro Castillo has been compared to being a left-wing terrorist, a Shining Path terrorist, right. And they're so angry. How are these people voting for him? But what they failed to realize is that there is a long history of these revolutionary people's movements that have come out of this region, even from the beginning. Cusco used to be the capital of the Incan Empire, and this is also part of like the central of the Andean region. And these people have been long resisting. One, they resisted the Spanish Empire. I believe it was in like the 1780s. There was like a 16-year period where there were almost 100 different people's uprisings, which is also the uprising of Tupac Amaru. And then you have years later, you have the same problem that comes on. These people are fighting against these big landlords that even at post-independence still controlled the vast majority of land in Peru, basically still kept them as slaves, though slavery was abolished. In the 1950s, the 1940s, there was a lot of people's uprisings that were coming out against their exploitation from these landlords. And this is where you see the Peruvian military going into stepping into putting down these rebellions. But which was interestingly enough in the 60s when the Peruvian military was sent to put down these rebellions. This is where the Peruvian military started incorporating and getting to know those people, getting to see their struggles and their sentiments, their left-wing people's sentiments started infiltrating the military to where the military held a coup. And they believe that the upper classes in Peru, the aristocracy, the elite political class, were not going to make enough revolutionary changes. So they staged a coup in Peru themselves and said, nope, we're going to do an agrarian revolution. And that's where you see General Juan Velasco Alvarado come in. And they do a agrarian reform. They break up a lot of these plantations and they give them to these peasant collectives so that they can, use their land. And then, there was a coup that was taken out, a lot of US interference, but also the Peruvian elite took him out. And then there's seemingly silence again. Okay, that's done and done. They got what they wanted. Let's move on. And then you go into the 1980s and the 1990s, where a lot of the Sendero Luminoso, the MRTA, a lot of their base was also these people in the central and the countryside, and they were joining. I mean, you hear some criticism about Sendero Luminoso. I have plenty, but one thing's for sure is that when people say like, "Oh, well, they killed indigenous people and they killed you," they forget that a lot of these people that were in Sendero Luminoso, that were in MRTA, were indigenous people themselves. Were these these peasants that were in the countryside, were part of them, and they were rising up and trying to, take power again in their country and have a revolution in Peru. That gets put down, as we know, Alan Garcia, and then really with Alberto Fujimori once they take out Guzman. And so that movement comes and it dies, and then we move on from the process, right? Okay, Sendero Luminoso is gone, or we defeated them. We're going to have neoliberalism and this, like, I don't want to say authoritarian, but this strong hand, fascist, almost fascist like stomping of this movement, and it's all going to be over. And then again, once again, now we see with Pedro Castillo, almost 30 years later, these people are still coming up again and saying, no, and you can't ignore us. You can't shut us up. You can't kill enough of us. Like, we're here. This is our country, and we're going to build a country that's for us. And I think it's really interesting because it's showing that there is a divide in Peru between the coastal, and I wouldn't say the coast is all elite. It's far from that. But there is a difference between the people that live on the coast who seemingly have a different kind of life than the people who live in the country. And it's not unique to Peru. This happens you can name any country in the world where people in the bigger cities and where there's more development, where there's more proletarians, you would say, than the countryside, where people live very differently. I mean, we were talking about it earlier, Fox, I live in New York City, but there's a lot of rich people here in New York, but the vast majority of New Yorkers are working class people. But when I hear your story about the public transportation, I mean, I think mine is bad, but it's not that bad. So even in this country, we have a divide about people who live in the rural side versus who live in the big cities and the coasts. But it's hitting a point in Peru where it's kind of nerve-wracking a little bit when you see that there are so many people who are also calling for a coup, which sounds really similar to the 2019 coup that happened in Bolivia. And so from there, I want to pass it on to Camila.
Yeah, and it's similar because the way in which her campaign, Fujimori's campaign, has made very vague accusations of what she says is systematic fraud and irregularities. So the first news conference, they came out and said those words without specifying anything else, just that numerous reports have arrived to us signaling irregularities and systematic fraud. And then we've had to wait for every next press conference to get more and more information about what exactly she's alleging. And that happened in 2019 as well. I mean, they weren't going to accept a win by the mass, and they had to just come out and say that there were irregularities and kind of latch on to what the OAS had said. But it happened again in 2020. They tried once again, this time, led again by Fernando Camacho, who said that he wanted Janine Áñez to decree, by presidential supreme decree, an audit of the elections. They saw that, for the most part, all of the international electoral missions were going to say that this election was carried out in all normality, that there had thus far not been any irregularities or any major problems, and they knew the extent to which it was being observed internationally, and how many, even just delegations which had come to accompany the elections, as well as journalists, because not everyone who partakes in observing an election is formally, an electoral observer, like the Progressive International, for example. So, they've just tried to make these very broad, vague accusations. And so what she said was that she said 500,000 actas were up for grabs at that point, or votes. Actas that amounted to what is 500,000, 500,000 votes. 200,000 of that was what she was going to be challenging and trying to get nullified. But she said that, the other actas that are still being counted, those ones, are still up in the air as well. So she was putting all sorts of massive numbers, knowing that at the time, Pedro Castillo was leading by 107,000 votes or so. Then a deadline had passed on Wednesday, June 9th, was it? So just days after the election, the National Electoral Jury gave them, this deadline that exists and is set in their electoral rules for which to submit challenges to the voting records. And they weren't able to submit those 800 actas, which were supposed to amount to 200,000 votes that they were going to challenge. They were only able to submit a small number of those appeals. And so that's what they've been going through very slowly now is looking at those votes. But a lot of the challenges have been that the person didn't sign, the poll worker did not sign in the correct spot. They signed somewhere else on the sheet, but that obviously shouldn't invalidate the vote of the people. Right. Just maybe it requires an additional look, but from the sounds of it, a lot of these have been, they've been turned down, which is to say that they're not going to be nullified. And so she's fighting this right now. She's fighting the fact that so many of them, she wanted the deadline to be extended. One member of this special electoral jury wanted to extend the deadline. The other three decided to reverse this decision they had made. And she wants to continue to submit these appeals to have, over 100,000 votes nullified. And of course, now we know that the count officially ended 2 days ago. The votes had been processed last week. 100% of them had been processed, which is to say they've been looked at, they've been scanned, they've been digitized or digitalized or whatever, and all the numbers were in, but they hadn't been counted completely. So they've now all been counted, and the margin is just under 50,000, or it's like 45,000 or so. So it's a much smaller margin that she has to make up, and she's looking for every possible way to do it. But it's just so obvious that she's on an absolute authoritarian tirade, and she's trying to, find any way possible. And what she's doing is appealing to the international community. They snapped at the governments of Bolivia and Argentina and Nicaragua for congratulating Pedro Castillo and the Peruvian people on their victory. And so the Foreign Ministry of Peru actually sent notices to their ambassadors in the country saying, don't get involved in this process, which is not complete, giving them a warning because they said that, you can't call Pedro Castillo president-elect when he hasn't been elected. But we have people from the far right, from Vox in Spain, and we have all sorts of other people who've also not only signed a letter that they wrote on behalf of Keiko Fujimori, but all sorts of other people are writing opinion articles in other countries in support of her presidency. So it's very bizarre that once again, anytime anyone who is remotely leftist touches an issue with a 10-foot pole, even if it's just a word of solidarity, it's interference. But we actually see interference by neoliberals all the time, including right now. It's neoliberals who completely dominate the media in every country, including Spanish media. A lot of the Spanish media comes from Spain, but also other, Latin American countries like Colombia. And so those people are getting involved as well. So it's becoming an international scandal now. And, this Sunday, it'll be two weeks. It's Thursday today, and we still don't have a declaration.
But it's pretty obvious that he's unofficially the winner. Like, he's got the most votes. Like, that information's transparent, right?
Well, like they say,
absolutely.
A dying dog. What is that saying? A dying dog bites. Like, Keiko Fujimori has a lot to lose if she doesn't win this presidency. She's looking at a 31-year jail sentence, and
I'm sorry. No, we should actually speak to her background. Keiko Fujimori. She's the daughter of the former dictator of Peru, who is currently in jail. So maybe let's talk about her and what she has plans for Peru versus Pedro Castillo.
I mean, I feel like this should be just as much of a scandal as even though it's not that much, that wasn't made. If you remember how the granddaughter of Mussolini, Alessandra Mussolini. She sits on like some high-ranking level, I believe in NATO. And she was like, oh, protect, like, this is like, can you imagine this is the daughter of a man who committed genocide against the Peruvian people, and that not just Keiko but also Kenji gets to be very active in Peruvian politics and have a successful career, where you have news pieces written about them, that it's like, do you understand that they led a genocide, they led a forced sterilization? Like, she should not have any place, let alone even an opportunity to be part of the presidency, and she's committed her own crimes. She's running for president under a conditional jail release.
Right.
She's an absolute monster herself. And it's like a spit in the face, but it's also quite scary, the fact that there's like at least 8.4 million Peruvians who have also voted for her.
Yeah, so there's going to be, both Fujimori and Castillo supporters are going to be holding their marches. She is calling people out to the streets. Both of them are saying in defense of their vote, in defense of democracy, and all of those lines. But obviously, since Monday morning, June 7th, the morning after the elections, Pedro Castillo took the lead, and that lead was never reversed. So people do feel that he's won. People do refer to him as president-elect in the country. And, these people, a lot of these people look to Evo Morales and the movement towards socialism for inspiration. And they watched very closely as the neighbors, experienced a coup that lasted a year. And so I think a lot of people, these, social organizations and unions, are prepared to fight, and they're not going to allow the same type of thing to happen in their own country. So there's a great march, I think it's like a great march in defense of democracy or something like that. They're calling it on Saturday, where there's going to be a lot of, campesino people and all sorts of people coming from different areas of the country to Lima once again to defend their vote and, defend this election process that was carried out in normality. And there's other lawmakers who are allied with Keiko Fujimori who haven't who are trying to push the idea that there needs to be another election. This is again what they said in 2019 in Bolivia, that they needed to redo the election. Why on earth, when no electoral observers have observed any normalities at all whatsoever, would they go as far as to hold another election when people have already cast their votes? So it's absolutely unbelievable, but they're going to have to defend it, and it's really difficult because they're doing so underneath, obviously, another right-wing government where the entire establishment is on side with Fujimori.
That's the thing that gets me the most about it too, is that, you'll see the Keiko Fujimori supporters, you'll see Keiko, they have their flags that says, my vote matters, respect my vote. But what they're fighting for, what they're on the streets for, is to annul other people's votes. It's not, your vote is the only one that's being respected. That's the thing. You're trying to silence other people's votes. Keiko Fujimori, she had a press conference the other day where she says, that it's so important that we do this. We need to fight against communism. This is what's our country's facing. This is why we need to do this. So you're admitting that you're fighting tooth and nail, fighting communism. We know this isn't communism, but we're not going to debate that.
Right.
This your idea that you don't agree with, which is
they are fighting communism because this is an extension of communism, is what they're fighting, and they know that. And I think when the right wing and the far right tells us the truth and they actually speak to our faces about what they're against, we have to take them seriously. And I think she's very serious. Her and other allies who have spoken out from other countries, if they identify something as being linked, they're talking about Guillermo Bermejo, they're talking about other elements of the Peru Libre party who are Marxists. Right. So maybe, as much as Pedro Castillo has adopted that line, we're not chavistas, we're not communists, we're not terrorists, he's speaking for himself, quite frankly. He's not speaking for his supporters, because a lot of his supporters are chavistas. And so I think that she has recognized that. And as many liberals and centrists as have supported his candidacy and the different candidates of the party, I think that she has recognized that this is something that is, that is, is related in some form to communism. And I think that is, part of what they're really afraid of. This is something that has, it has brought people out with these placards to the street that says they're against communism. And I think that's a really powerful thing. It tells us a lot about the potential in Peru. And I think that now is the time for them, for the people who vaguely associate themselves with socialism to take a stand. And hopefully they can do that instead of adopting this line that we're not communists, we're not terrorists, etc. I think it's time for them to take a stand and say, I believe in what I believe in, call it what you want to call it. And that's what they've had to do in, Bolivia and other countries. I think it's a bit of a waste of energy and selling themselves short, by saying those lines that Pedro Castillo has been pressured to say exactly. in order to meet the minimum requirements of running for public office in Latin America, when everyone is shamed to death for having any affiliation with anything remotely leftist. Mm-hmm. And if you look at his policies, I mean, those are the same policies that the actual self-declared Marxist politicians and parties in other countries have run on, except they weren't afraid to say what they are.
Right.
Well, regardless, the people in Peru have chosen Pedro Castillo, and you don't have the right, even though you're going to do it anyway, you don't have the right to silence their votes. You don't have the right to say that you're defending democracy when you are simply using whatever mechanisms that you have to silence the majority of the country who has voted for Pedro Castillo, who, like Camila said, are part of the left, are fighting for the left, are fighting for socialists in Marxist parties. Peru Libre is a Marxist party. They voted for them. They didn't vote for you, and you have to respect that. But it's a sham. It's a sham. They're not defending any democracy. They're defending their own power. They're defending their own wealth. And they show their face. They say, by damn the Peruvian people, we don't give a fuck what you want, Peruvian people, because you're taking us out. You're taking us out of power. No. And I think that says a lot. This is Keiko showing her ass what a Keiko presidency would even look like. It would be further ignoring and decimating the rights of Peruvian people and the self-determination of the Peruvian people.
Yeah, it seems like she wants to open up the national resources to foreign governments and foreign business people. I think there's a big contrast between Pedro Castillo's program, which he wants to take the natural resources and improve and use that to help improve the people's livelihoods there, their economic conditions. And I think we've seen a lot of these so-called leftists here in the US side with the imperialists who want Keiko Fujimori because they will benefit from her presidency or dictatorship there. So I think we should also highlight how the rad libs and ultras here, who are also attacking Pedro Castillo for not being woke enough, to help. I think they need to understand that once you help improve people's economic conditions, people's social consciousness also improves as well. And I think they are missing that, because I think they take what Pedro Castillo has said out of context, because they say that he's homophobic and doesn't want gay people to be gay or whatever, and that's not what he said. So I think I don't know who wants to take this, but let's.
I also just want to add that even if you did have backwards ideas about gay people, if you ultimately believe in improving my economic conditions, I mean, I really don't care if you think gay people are real or not. I want to be able to retire one day.
Exactly.
I don't want to work until I die. That sounds horrible. Like if you want to nationalize resources, to give me health care, to make sure I can retire, to make sure I can afford a house, I might vote for you. But yeah, we would really love your thoughts on that.
Well, I don't even know where to begin. I think that even like when we say like conservative social views, like it's not even like one monolithic thing. There's just all sorts of people who don't have super progressive views, but they're not even the same person. So, I mean, I really think that the United States has had just so many waves of completely ass backwards people with these sorts of ideas, these conservative ideas being pumped out through this mega media machine, and people like Pat Robertson. Now we have Mike Pompeo coming and like pretending that he's this like ultra conservative guy, even though he was kind of like more moderately conservative, but he's going to be running on that for the office of president. So now he's trying to bring back those extremist views against gays and stuff like that. I mean, this is just a tool that they've used in the US. In Bolivia, in the rural area where I live, there are so many people who, if you just ask them, are you for or against gay marriage? They're in the area I live in, they're going to say, I'm against it. They'll say, I'm against gay marriage. And then if you ask them why, they're going to say, well, I don't know, I'm just not for it. And then if you say, well, I'm gay and I want to be able to be married, and they'll be like, oh, well, maybe you should be able to get married. They're not going to sit there and debate you on the point because they don't give a fuck, because they don't care. This is not at the top of their agenda. They don't have like an anti-gay agenda. It's just, guess what? According to them and their belief and everyone around them, there's no gays where they live. They believe that, you know, the only people who are gay are the people who live in the city, and that in the countryside, in the rural area, the people who live as campesinos, who grow fruit and coca, they're everybody is heterosexual. And what they're concerned about is that, you know, a few years ago, they were able to get a piece of land through land reform schemes. And now what they're concerned about is pressuring the government, local and national authorities, and, you know, whatever regional authorities, to build a little bridge or a road in front of their farm, because now they have land, but they can't do anything, and they can't get a truck to pull up to bring produce. They have to like literally carry produce on their back. So it's like, yeah, they have like a plot of like muddy land, like next to like a watery ditch with like mosquitoes to like live on and produce things. And now they have food. In some ways, they're like self-sufficient, but then how can they sell food? How can they take it to the market? I mean, these are the sort of like immediate economic needs that people have. And if you try to explain to them, like, some people are extremely open-minded. If you try to explain to them that there's this person who identifies as trans in the city of Santa Cruz, and that this person is an influencer on Instagram, and that they're trying to raise money for an operation, and if you try to give this all this information, they're going to be like, wow, this is everything you've said to me. This is the first time I've heard it, or I've only vaguely heard about it one other time. And it's just so like not applicable to my immediate situation, my immediate needs. You know, people who live in rural areas, they also want their children to be able to go to fancy universities, whether it's the best university in Bolivia or abroad. They want people to be able to study, to be able to have opportunities. And these are all the different things people are thinking about. Like, there are people who believe that they have to learn English or send their kids off to school to learn English, or otherwise they're going to be, you know, working, doing manual labor the rest of their lives. So this is like what's more pressing to them. You know, not issues that don't necessarily, you know, that they don't necessarily come in contact with every day. So I don't even see these people as that conservative, to be honest, in this particular context that I'm talking about where I live. Because if you explain things to them, they're like, okay, like, sure, I'll take your word on it, since you're the only person to have ever explained this to me. You took the time to explain it. Thanks, it's really interesting. And it's exactly the same when you talk about abortion with people. I would say that like a lot of the women union leaders around Tropico have very progressive views, are very open-minded, and are very strong women leaders, while at the same time, some of them don't support the right for women to have, you know, free, accessible, and safe abortions. So it's kind of a bizarre thing, because in every sense, it's just unbelievable to have so many strong leaders with such high qualifications, you know, leading the union movement. And some of them, you know, are going to kind of move into like the political sphere and take, you know, office at a lower level, you know, become like a mayor or a lawmaker in the, you know, departmental legislature, and then, you know, maybe a congressperson eventually. But they don't necessarily support the, you know, the right of women, at least not in a very proactive way to be able to access abortions. And then in the city, you have people who do. All of these people are, members or the rank and file of the movement towards socialism party, the largest party in the country. And you have people all over the spectrum on these social issues, and they continue to support, a socialist project, which is, the mainstream, and certainly the leftist wing of the movement towards socialism party. Not all of them are going to be, born and raised in La Paz and going to, fancy university that teaches people about gender and other issues. So I think that we just need to be like a little more, just a little more sensitive to what people's backgrounds are and stuff like that, especially in rural Latin America. And yeah, again, like in the US, it's supposed to be like the most developed, most wealthy country in the world. And people have extremely conservative views still today. But when I was growing up, I mean, I just remember people making judgments about the clothes you're wearing. If I was wearing this type of shirt, like, and I was going out with a friend, and one of the neighbors might say something like, you guys look like prostitutes, you guys look like whores, you're 14 years old, why are you wearing shorts that short when you're 14? I mean, all sorts of views like that. And I know that some views like that continue to exist. So I can't imagine why anyone from the global north would even feel as if they could make a comment.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree with you. This isn't about always being a leftist or a socialist. It's not always about always taking the leftist position on everything all the time. This is about meeting people where they're at. You have to meet where the masses are at and working with them from there. And the only way for people to recognize and think about these things on a deeper, on a more conscious level is if you improve their economic conditions. And that's what a lot of Western or US leftists don't like to think about, because they're not in these situations. They go to these fancy schools. They don't have to worry about when they're going to eat, what kind of jobs they're going to have, what kind of, if they have a paved road, even though in the US they are unpaving roads in the United States, but that they don't have that reality. It's a different reality for people in the global South. And I think Pedro is meeting people where they're at, and it can only get better with their social consciousness if the economic conditions improve, and that's what he wants to do. That's his plan.
They're also hyper fixating on this, like, oh, well, he has these conservative views on gay people, on gender theory, on women and abortion. Well, if you read Peru Libre and their position on abortion, it actually makes a lot of sense. And it's not coming from a position of we hate women and all that. It's coming from more of an economic position, similar to what Romania had to face with during its socialist era. But obviously, they're pushing forward to building a state where they can open these things up. Right. And then, his positions on like gender theory, I think it's a lot, because the rad lib stuff, while it exists a lot in the US, I've seen it in these like coastal Lima, students. A lot of them are like, they remind me exactly of like rad libs and progressives in the United States too. A lot of them are only supporting Castillo against Keiko Fujimori, but then also still make criticisms of him, talk a lot of shit about Cerrón. They're just, and it's all about like, oh, well, they don't like the gender theory. But if you look at them themselves, there are these radical students who are studying, like Camila was saying before, in these fancy universities, learning about gender, learning about sexuality, learning about women's rights. And a lot of this is also exported from the global north. It's exported from academia in the United States, which it is all like it pretends to be radical, but it ultimately serves an anti-communist and anti-masses and anti-left message. And so they can't seem to take the wool off their eyes that, listen, whatever, Pedro Castillo might think that your gender theory is bourgeois and super Western and super anti-working class in its nature. But what he's ultimately saying is that he wants to build a constitution that is popular, made by and for the masses. And if the masses want this, then they will get it. And the socialist project is a project. It's a process. It doesn't happen in a night. People want to talk about, oh, look at Cuba, and when Fidel Castro used to put gay people in camps, and now it's one of the safest places for LGBTQ people in all of Latin America. It's a process, and it changes, and you meet the masses where they're at, but you don't leave them where they're at. You don't leave them where you
Right.
found them. You don't leave them where you found them.
Exactly.
Another fun fact, they also decriminalized homosexuality before the US did. Fun fact.
And they also pay for, you know, gender reassignment surgery, and they give you HRT. And that's not something that the United States can't even have a fraction of that. You know, so again, it's one, the radlibs here, they want to hyper fixate on this, and ignoring that the United States also has a completely different historical setting. I remember when I was in Peru, I think it was in 2004. I was like a teenager at some point, and it was one of like the first huge women marches ever in the city. And the movement of feminism that happened in Latin America it developed differently than the movement that happened here in the United States. It was where in Saratoga, where feminist movement was born in 1848 in Saratoga with that Declaration of the Rights of Women. You know, we've had a different position, we've had a different development in our social rights that the rest of the world really hasn't. And it's not to say that the rest of the world is backwards, it's just we've all developed very differently, and that's okay and that's fine. But you can't apply your US lens onto every other country in the world. And that's the same thing where a lot of these students, even in Peru, in these universities, these radical students in really all over Latin America, where they get this social radlib, you know, gender studies from the universities, and it all comes especially with this a Western lens.
I find that quite frustrating. As someone who, I do have a degree in gender studies, and after my education, I really started diving deeper into Marxist theory and socialism, and I find a lot of the pink imperialism comes from a lot of these radical liberal frameworks and of understanding. And I remember in a classroom getting into it with a young woman about Israel and Palestine. We were talking about pinkwashing, and I do feel a little concern for Castillo as he faces, these charges of homophobia, because that's how they're going to manufacture consent for overthrowing him later. So I think it's really important that we defend Peru and Castillo and say, well, he's the one we've got to support. He wants to uplift everyone's economic conditions. I think that is vastly more important than whatever transgression, like people in the United States academic setting or not even the academic setting. Like I see a lot of like I'm in a lot of Facebook groups. I see a lot of talk like this where it's like, if you don't agree with, if you don't support anything LGBT, like if you even have a question, like they pounce on you and they drag you through the mud and you're disposable to them. I think it's bullying. I think it's really, really toxic. And I think that it's a product of it's CIA bullshit, like we've got to really, really reject that and really make our positions firm, because ultimately this is the better option.
Listen, the Peruvian bourgeoisie is not going to, whatever, if they want to pretend that they're pro-women, Keiko's pro-women, she's pro-LGBTQ, it's not going to matter when everybody is still economically suffering, they're not vaccinated, they don't have their jobs, they're continuing to be exploited by multinational companies and their own bosses. It's really not going to matter when you're, dirt poor, you don't have a roof in your house, you can't afford to go education, you can't afford to get public health care. It really isn't going to matter that, well, now you have a girl boss president that looks like you.
Right. And so what I want to say is, socialism isn't when everyone agrees with you. I'm really sorry, but as socialists, we fight for everyone's economic conditions, not just the people that we are ideologically aligned with. That is not Marxism. That is not socialism. That is backwards. Stop that.
I know. So before we wrap, what can leftists learn in the US from this victory? And what does it mean for the people of Peru?
Well, I think well, I do think I'll go short because I think you probably have much more to say. But I think, like I saw Kayla online months ago. Maybe I've probably been following Kayla on Twitter for like, let's say a year. And I remember her saying some things that seemed kind of damning about the political situation in Peru, making it sound like there is no concerted left movement. And, other people have said things like that it was kind of a hopeless situation and like that we don't have, very good prospects electorally. And like, so this is a really great development and it's very exciting. And what it tells us is that Pedro Castillo and Peru Libre were able to bring together a vast cross-section of the country. And there are so many people with practically diametrically opposed positions on issues, on LGBT issues, on abortion, on everything else and in between, from completely different backgrounds. A lot of the people who are protesting in favor of Castillo, defending his victory, are actually from Lima. They could be people who are middle-class professionals as well. And so it's just, this is exactly what needs to be replicated in every country. And this is what Evo Morales has said and what he has told us again and again about the reasons why the MAS was so successful and continues to be such a large party, because there are middle-class professionals from the cities, and there are also Campesino indigenous people from the rural areas, and all of which, are supporting the same basic policies of nationalization of resources, of controlling state resources and investing those profits into social programs, accessibility of education, improving the educational and, public education and public health systems, and, sovereignty and all these sorts of things. These are all very basic things that a large section of the population will have to agree on to be able to have, advance electorally. And, Veronica Mendoza, didn't have a chance in terms of, getting the votes from the rest of these necessary places in order to advance to the next round. And this is Veronica Mendoza is the person who got all of the coverage internationally from the left, the person that was getting endorsements from all these hippy dippy people in Caracas and La Paz, everywhere. Everyone was just loving her and her message and her campaign. And quite frankly, if you ask the actual average Peruvian people, that did not resonate with them at all. And she was even getting a little bit of coverage there. Obviously she was ignored as well as is any leftist candidate in any campaign in the major network media. But so it just shows you how quickly things can come together. And I think that's especially important for a country like the US, where the only thing you hear anyone ever say is that the left is so fragmented. There's so many groups, all these groups are so small, so many parties, blah, blah, blah. And yeah, this is obviously true and it's definitely a barrier. But at the end of the day, things can come together very quickly. And it's just amazing that Castillo was the person to be able to do that. But this is what we're going for. And this is the beginning of something in Peru. And, the model needs to be replicated in other places.
I think so. I agree with that too a lot, that, Veronica Mendoza, while she had a lot of great ideas and I supported her from here. And again, it goes back to the fact that I live in the United States. I come from a huge American lens, and a lot of her base was the Peruvian radicals, the middle class, which didn't resonate with a lot of the masses of the people. One thing you find very interesting about Pedro Castillo, even when he's saying, I'm not a Chavista, I'm not a communist, but he always emphasizes this one thing: I'm a worker just like everybody else here, just like all you people. He doesn't come off with saying, well, I am a poor indigenous man who broke an arm when I was 12. No, he's talking about meeting the immediate needs of the working class people and the peasant people all over Peru, and is able to unite them all through that, despite whether being not the wokest, sorry, my dog was barking, but not being the wokest and not, going out and saying, I'm the truest Marxist Leninist everywhere and I have 12 degrees in China. No, he's meeting the immediate demands of the people, resonating with them, being a man that's coming from the people, from the masses itself, and not sitting in an ivory tower on top of them. And I think that in the United States, and the left needs to get behind that. We need to build a strong working class movement, not just we don't need to be focusing on, is it black enough led, is it indigenous led, right? Are the white people to the back sitting in the back, do we have all these different marginalized? No, come on, we need to focus on our immediate demands. And this is why you have a lot of people in the United States, one, not only fragmented, but going towards further to the right, because they're the ones that are seemingly populist. That's what that's what they want. They want somebody that's going to meet their economic needs, whether they be whatever color on the universe, whatever they come from, whatever background. People are really, concerned about their economic positions as we're furthering into a decline. The United States is going to decline. The empire is going to fall. We need to make sure that we build a socialist country, because we're really looking at a fascist country coming soon. And so you got to pick, people. You got to pick. You can't have your every little fantasy utopian of the movement led, because this is a very diverse country with a lot of different kinds of people from very different backgrounds. But we all have one thing in common, and is that we want to survive. We want to eat. We want to have education. We want to have health care. We want to be able to have jobs that pay us well, that we're comfortable with, that we don't have to face homelessness, that we don't have to go to housing court. And if you can talk about that, and you can lead people with that and unite us over that, we can do the same thing, just as Peru is trying to do. And it means a lot to the Peruvian people as we're coming on to the whoever wins. I mean, we know that Pedro Castillo is the Peruvian pick. Who knows what could happen with all these different imperial powers and the elite powers combined, but whoever gets inaugurated on this July 28th will be inaugurated on the 200th year of Peruvian independence. And what we want to see in Peru, what Peruvians want to see, is a real, true, new Peru, a Peru that's fighting for Peruvian liberation, that is building towards that. That's a Peru for, I don't want to say Peru for Peruvians, but a Peru for the working and Peruvian masses. Because right now, Peru is like an open sail door. Come in, you got enough money. They used to sell Peruvian citizenship for $5,000. Just come in, take Peru, whatever piece you want. If you got enough money, you can take it. While the rest of the Peruvian people are suffering, having the highest per capita death rates of COVID, less people enrolled in universities because they can't afford it. Poverty is increasing every single day because people don't have their immediate economics needs met. And I think it's very important to see this new tide, create a new constitution, throw away the one from the dictatorship, and truly build a Peru for the Peruvian people with Peru Libre, with, the large coalitions of the masses in the rural and also in the cities too. This is one of the beautiful things that I think could really come out of this, is that it kind of broke my heart to see a lot of Peruvians because, we could say what we want about Lima. It is a big city, but there's a lot of slums in Lima. My parents come from the slums. My mom comes from El Rimac. And this is, interesting thing aside, I have an aunt from El Rimac who, voted for Keiko Fujimori. And I have my friend, his father from Rimac, who voted for Pedro Castillo. These two people from the same slums who voted for completely different people, and there's a reason for that. We can't just say immediately, well, all the limeños are, these elites and they're all white. And, I think that's a very reductive view of it. There's a lot of propaganda when all of the media in Peru is owned by the wealthy, the Fujimoristas. All the private schools and all the education that they get are pro-neoliberal, pro-right-wing policies. This is something that the people are being fed constantly. And what a new Peru could do is open change, open to people understanding, and open some class consciousness, because that's what is missing both in the United States and even in the movement in Peru. Before, it was the people there don't have the class consciousness. If people in Rimac, if people in Comas are voting for Keiko Fujimori, meanwhile they don't have roofs, there's a misunderstanding there. And I think that with the rise of Pedro Castillo, with education and proper attention, this could change. And so I think this is a very big thing. I'm praying. Tomorrow in New York City, a bunch of us are going out, and as Camila was saying before, there's going to be marches on both sides. Well, even here in New York City, Peruvians have gotten together, and we're demanding that our votes count. Peru counts. Listen to the Peruvian masses. We have our sovereignty, our self-determination, and we want Pedro Castillo, and he's the rightful president of Peru. And this is what we're going to demand continuously. So hopefully that we can build a Peru for the working and Peruvian masses, and not for transnational corporations, not for compradors, not for neoliberals and right-wingers, but a Peru for the working Peruvian masses.
And you can also carry a placard that says, and we're Chavista and communist as well.
I want to wear a shirt that says, sí al comunismo.
Well, that was beautifully said, both of you. Thank you so much for joining us. But before we wrap, remind people where they can find your work.
Well, Chaos Astro News, we're trying to be as active as possible on Twitter with the updates for Peru. We haven't been because, people have to travel and do other things sometimes, but we're getting back into it now. And we have a website, a Facebook, of course. We try to upload all of our videos on YouTube. So Chaos News is where we are.
And as for me, I'm just organizing, working with my party and the Party of Communists USA, and we're getting involved with the Pumas Collective. I mean, been involved in the Pumas Collective, but trying to get more involved, especially leading up to the 200th anniversary. And Pumas Collective, it's a collective of Peruvians in outside of Peru, mostly in the English-speaking North and Canada and England, and we're socialists, and we give information, translate, try to support Peruvians, organizers on the ground as we can. And so that's where, if you want to go follow the Pumas Collective on Instagram.
Definitely.
Right.
Thank you both so much, and we look forward to doing this again soon.
Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. Let's do it again.
Yes.